Welcome to The Wise Woman. Today we are summarizing Women and Economics by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a visionary book on women's economic independence and its power of transformation. Introduction. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is a key figure in American feminism at the turn of the 20th century. Born in 1860 in Connecticut, Gilman grew up in a context marked by economic difficulties and limited education, which made her profoundly aware of the issue of social and gender inequality. An intellectual, social reformer, and prolific author, she made her mark on history with her ability to lucidly analyze the condition of women in a patriarchal society and to propose innovative solutions for their emancipation. Also known for her famous short story The Yellow Wallpaper, she always used her pen to denounce invisible oppressions and to call for a deep change in mentalities. Her book Women and Economics, first published in 1898, is situated in a pivotal period when the United States was experiencing great social upheavals, rapid industrialization, urbanization, the rise of civil rights and feminist movements, but also the persistence of blatant economic inequalities between the sexes. It is in this context that Gilman proposes a bold, almost revolutionary analysis for her time, of the place of women in the economy and in society. In it, she develops a simple but powerful idea. The economic independence of women is the key to their freedom and to collective progress. At the end of the 19th century, women were for the most part confined to the role of wives and mothers, financially dependent on their husbands to provide for their needs and those of their children. This model, according to Gilman, was not only unjust, but also ineffective and harmful to society as a whole. She highlights how economic dependence creates a form of modern servitude, where the woman, deprived of access to resources and decisions, finds herself confined to a domestic space that limits her intellectual, creative, and social potential. The main objective of Women and Economics is therefore clear: to open the eyes of women and men to the invisible mechanisms of this oppression while proposing concrete ways to escape it. Gilman does not merely describe the problems, she analyzes them from an economic, almost scientific angle by demonstrating that the exclusion of women from productive external work is a waste of talent and a loss for society as a whole. She advocates for a profound reorganization of family, professional, and social life, where men and women would be equal partners in the creation of wealth and in the education of future generations. This book, although written more than a century ago, still resonates powerfully today. Wage inequality, the underrepresentation of women in certain economic sectors, the difficulties of balancing professional and personal life, and the persistent weight of gender stereotypes are all issues that are still relevant. Reading Women and Economics is therefore not only about understanding the roots of these issues, but also about discovering a visionary thought that remains astonishingly modern. Through this summary, we will explore the heart of this book together, understanding the traditional role of women as it was perceived at the time, analysing the limits of the domestic model, and discovering the bold solutions that Gilman proposed to build a more just and balanced society. It is a journey through time, but also a dialogue between past and present, which pushes us to reflect on the importance of women's autonomy, education, and economic recognition in the construction of a more egalitarian world. Chapter 1. The Traditional Role of Women. In Women and Economics, Charlotte Perkins Gilman undertakes a meticulous and lucid analysis of the traditional role imposed on women, a role shaped by centuries of social, economic, and cultural structures that have systematically limited their potential. For Gilman, the home, often perceived as the natural and ideal sanctuary for women, was in reality nothing more than a gilded cage where economic dependence and the absence of individual freedom condemned entire generations to live in a state of invisible but deeply rooted servitude. She explains that this situation did not result from a natural choice, nor from a supposed feminine inferiority, but rather from a system designed and maintained by imbalanced power relations. This analysis begins with a fundamental observation. Domestic work, presented as the sacred duty of women, was used as a tool of social control. Women were assigned to repetitive and time-consuming household tasks, which, although essential to the survival of the family, produced no recognized economic value outside the home. Cooking, cleaning, raising children, and maintaining the household were invisible, unpaid activities, and considered natural, which prevented women from claiming any autonomy. This invisibility of domestic female labour contributed to perpetuating a vision according to which women were dependents, incapable of producing or managing economic resources by themselves. Gilman insists on the fact that this assignment was not simply a question of the division of tasks, but truly a mechanism of subtle domination. By locking the woman in the home, she was prevented from participating in the productive and economic life of society, which considerably reduced her opportunities for personal development. Marriage, in this context, was not a freely chosen union between two equal individuals, but a disguised economic contract where the man became the provider of resources and the woman, the dependent consumer. This dynamic created an implicit but implacable hierarchy. The one who holds financial control holds decision-making power, and the one who depends is condemned to silence and obedience. This system of financial dependence had profound consequences for women's individual freedom. By having no income of their own, they had no voice or power in their own home, let alone in the public sphere. They had to ask, sometimes beg, to obtain the slightest material good. This absence of economic independence placed them in a position of extreme vulnerability. They could not leave an abusive husband, they could not pursue their own ambitions, and they could not offer their children a model of autonomy and strength. Gilman forcefully denounces this vicious cycle that turned generations of women into dependents against their will, and that normalized a form of social infantilization. But this dependence was not limited to the economic level. It also had psychological and cultural repercussions. By growing up in societies where the only valued destiny for a woman was that of a wife and mother, girls very early on integrated the idea that they did not need to develop professional skills, to pursue studies, or to cultivate themselves beyond what was necessary to keep a home. Gilman highlights that this self-limitation, instilled from childhood, reinforced the status quo and perpetuated generations of undertrained women, confined to subordinate roles. The education of girls focused almost exclusively on preparation for marriage and domestic tasks, leaving little room for the development of critical thinking, intellectual curiosity, or personal ambition. In parallel, society justified this division of roles with pseudo-scientific or religious arguments. It was claimed that women were naturally made to take care of the home and children, that their gentle, empathetic, and sacrificial nature made them unfit for the challenges of the economic and political world. These discourses, widely relayed by religious institutions, the media, and even school textbooks, contributed to cementing an idealized but profoundly limiting image of the virtuous, devoted, and silent woman. Gilman methodically debunks this belief by highlighting that it has no biological or natural basis. It is not feminine nature that limits women to the home, but rather social constructs designed to preserve male privileges. One of the most insidious aspects of this traditional role is that it was often presented as a privilege. Women were convinced that being protected and provided for by a husband was a proof of love and security. However, for Gilman, this paternalistic vision masked a much darker reality. The loss of autonomy and the impossibility of existing outside this dependent relationship. This illusion of economic comfort was all the more dangerous because it maintained a social inertia, preventing women from claiming their place in professional and intellectual spheres. Gilman emphasizes that even women from the highest social classes, often exempted from certain domestic tasks thanks to domestic workers or maids, remained prisoners of this system because they had no direct control over the wealth they consumed. Motherhood, perceived as the sacred mission of women, was also instrumentalized to justify their confinement in the home. It was claimed that a good mother had to dedicate all her time, all her energy, and even her entire identity to her children. Although Gilman recognizes the importance of motherhood, she vigorously criticizes the idea that this justifies a whole life of dependence and self-denial. According to her, Confining women to motherhood amounts to a waste of their creative and intellectual potential, while keeping them in a position of vulnerability. She advocates for a redefinition of motherhood, which is no longer synonymous with total sacrifice but with a shared role, supported by collective and social structures capable of freeing up time and energy for other activities. This traditional role, Gilman emphasizes, was not only unjust for women, it was also harmful to society as a whole. By depriving women of the possibility of actively contributing to economic life, the productive and creative force of a nation was cut in half. Women's talents, their intelligence, their sensitivity, their ideas remained untapped, leading to a delay in development for the entire community. What's more, this dependence created toxic power dynamics in homes, where the submission of one family member was institutionalized and normalized. Gilman thus invites her contemporaries to become aware that the traditional domestic model is not a foregone conclusion, but a social construct that can and must evolve. She demonstrates that this model, far from protecting the woman or guaranteeing her happiness, deprives her of her dignity, her voice, and her potential. This observation, which might have seemed radical at the time, was in reality profoundly lucid and visionary. For behind this analysis, Gilman was already paving the way for the feminist revolutions of the 20th century, which would question the gendered division of roles and demand equality in all areas of life. By observing this traditional role from an economic angle, Gilman shines a light on a truth that few had dared to formulate. As long as women remained confined to the home, without direct access to resources, no real emancipation would be possible. For her, economic independence was not a secondary option, but the very foundation of freedom. She insisted that a society that systematically deprives half of its population of this economic autonomy cannot claim to be progressive or equitable. This awareness, initiated in the pages of Women and Economics, would become one of the pillars of the feminist movements of the following decades, making this book not only a work of analysis but also a call to action. Chapter 2. The Domestic Economy and Its Limits. In Women and Economics, Charlotte Perkins Gilman deepens her analysis with incisive clarity of what she calls the domestic economy and its limits, a bold and visionary critique that questions the traditional role assigned to women in the private sphere. For Gilman, domestic work, as it was conceived and practiced in her time, represented a subtle but very real form of servitude. She doesn't disparage it as such, because she recognizes its necessity for the proper functioning of a home and for the well-being of family members. But she forcefully denounces the fact that this work, considered a natural and immutable mission for women, was never valued or compensated to the extent of its importance, confining those who dedicated themselves to it to a state of economic and social dependence that deprived them of any real autonomy. For Gilman, this servitude lies not only in the repetitive and constraining nature of household tasks, preparing meals, cleaning, doing laundry, raising children, but especially in the lack of social and economic recognition attached to this labour. She observes that in the social structure of the late 19th century, domestic work was perceived as a natural vocation for women, an extension of their supposedly innate qualities of gentleness, patience, and devotion. This social view locks women into a fixed role, where their contribution, no matter how indispensable it is rendered invisible and unpaid. Gilman vigorously criticizes this paradox. In an economic system where all productive work is paid and measured, domestic work, which nevertheless supports the entire society, remains confined to a grey area, excluded from the circuits of valuation. This invisibility maintains a structural dependence. Since the woman has no income of her own, she can neither claim financial autonomy, nor have any real decision-making power, nor free herself from an oppressive marital relationship without risking destitution or social exclusion. Gilman's analysis is of astonishing modernity because she doesn't just state this reality, she dissects its deep mechanisms. She demonstrates that the home, as it is conceived, functions as a closed economic unit in which the woman is not an independent producer but a dependent consumer. The husband who holds the income becomes the provider and the decision-maker, while the woman, in charge of maintaining this domestic microcosm, finds herself confined to a space that offers neither evolution nor recognition nor intellectual fulfillment. This system, which Gilman implicitly calls archaic, prevents women from developing their talents, gaining professional experience, or actively participating in the economic life of their community. She shows that this pattern benefits no one in the long run, as it limits creativity and innovation in the family sphere and slows down overall social progress. This critique is articulated around a central argument. Domestic work, although essential, is not productive in the economic sense of the term, because it does not generate a market exchange, nor capital, nor an accumulation of wealth for the person who performs it. A woman who dedicates her entire life to her home can give the best of herself, but she remains, in the eyes of society, without economic value. She does not build a career, does not contribute to her own financial security, and cannot claim any real independence. Gilman insists on this point. As long as women's work remains confined to the domestic space without recognition or remuneration, their dependence on men will be structural and systemic, no matter the progress in other areas. This idea, radical for the time, is still strikingly relevant today, as it raises the question of the value of invisible work, which remains a subject of debate in contemporary discussions on gender equality. Gilman doesn't just describe this problem. She also exposes its psychological and social effects. The assignment of women to a limited space and to repetitive tasks eventually stifles their intellectual and creative potential. She speaks of this confinement of feminine genius, a stifling routine that curbs the spirit, prevents personal fulfillment, and nourishes a feeling of uselessness. Women, convinced that their role is limited to serving their husband and children, end up internalizing this dependence and resigning themselves to an existence where they can neither dream, nor create, nor project themselves into a different future. Gilman sees in this reality a profound injustice, but also an immense waste of talent for society. The author proposes an enlightening comparison between domestic work and productive work done outside the home. In the world of work, an effort provides a direct, measurable remuneration, generally proportional to skill and investment. The worker, man or woman, benefits from a certain social recognition, a possible progression, and a financial independence that allows them to make decisions and choose their life paths. Conversely, in the home, a woman's work provides her with none of these advantages. It is constant, often more physically and emotionally demanding, but totally disconnected from the mechanisms of economic valuation. Gilman emphasizes that this difference is not a foregone conclusion, but the product of an inequitable social organization that could be rethought. She also highlights that this system, which confines women to non-productive roles, is inefficient for society as a whole. By restricting women to unpaid domestic activities, the economy is deprived of a skilled workforce. The development of new skills is limited and innovation is slowed down. Gilman imagines a social organization where domestic tasks would be shared or collectivized, communal kitchens, collective childcare services, collaborative living spaces that would allow women to free up time and energy to invest in productive and creative activities. These ideas, which seemed utopian at the end of the 19th century, prefigured social and economic evolutions that would not come to fruition until several decades later, with the massive entry of women into the labour market and the development of family support infrastructures. Another crucial point in Gilman's argument is that this domestic assignment perpetuates a profoundly unequal power dynamic in couple relationships. The man, as the exclusive provider of financial resources, holds an almost absolute decision-making power over the material aspects of shared life. The woman, being dependent, does not have the means to contest, to negotiate, or to free herself from an unsatisfactory or abusive relationship. Gilman emphasizes that this power dynamic, internalized and normalized, contributes to maintaining entire generations of women in situations of submission, often invisible and silent. She sees in this one of the structural causes of feminine oppression, an oppression that is not limited to the home but extends to all spheres of social, political, and cultural life. By analysing the limits of the domestic economy, Gilman also opens a reflection on the immense potential that the integration of women into the productive world represents. She imagines a society where women could, on an equal footing with men, contribute through their work, their ideas, and their creativity, while being freed from the material and psychological constraints related to dependence. In this vision, economic independence becomes the primary condition for freedom and equality. She doesn't just demand women's access to paid work. She advocates for a profound transformation of mentalities and social structures so that women's work, whether domestic or productive, is recognized, valued, and fairly compensated. This chapter of Women and Economics is particularly powerful because it is not limited to a theoretical critique. It also proposes a prospective vision of a society reorganized around principles of equity and cooperation. Gilman perceives with a rare clarity that the problem is not only individual but collective. As long as society continues to consider domestic work as a natural and unpaid responsibility of women, no true emancipation will be possible. She calls for a collective awakening and a radical restructuring of economic and social systems so that the value of work, whatever it is recognized and compensated equitably. This critique of the limits of the domestic economy still retains all its relevance today. In many contemporary societies, domestic work remains largely invisible and undervalued, and women continue to bear a disproportionate burden of household and parental tasks, even when they hold full-time jobs. Gilman's analysis therefore resonates as a still current warning. Equality cannot be achieved without a profound transformation of the way in which work, in all its forms, is perceived, organized, and rewarded. Chapter 3. The Economic Independence of Women. In Women and Economics, Charlotte Perkins Gilman explains with impressive lucidity why women's economic independence is not only an individual need, but also a collective necessity for the progress of an entire society. She starts from a simple but implacable observation. As long as women do not possess their own means of subsistence, they remain in a state of structural dependence that prevents them from fully flourishing and freely contributing to the world. This lack of independence is not just a financial issue, but a problem of dignity, power, and fundamental freedom. Gilman emphasizes that this economic dependence is the foundation upon which the entire patriarchal hierarchy that has dominated human relationships for centuries rests. Access to paid work, for Gilman, is not a secondary demand or a simple comfort. It is an essential condition for women to be able to exist as autonomous and fully integrated individuals in the social body. She explains that, in the traditional model where the man is the provider of resources and the woman the manager of the home, the woman has no real control over her life. She does not freely choose her actions, her relationships, or even her aspirations. Her existence is suspended on the goodwill or whims of the one who holds economic power, whether it be the husband, the father, or another male guardian. This dynamic of dependence is deeply alienating, as it denies women the most basic right, that of self-determination. Gilman insists on the fact that paid work represents much more than a source of income. It is a tool for intellectual, moral, and social liberation. Working allows women to access a public space where their abilities are recognized, where their contribution has a measurable value, and where they can form egalitarian relationships with others. She observes that women who work, even in difficult conditions, develop a more assertive self-awareness, a strengthened personal esteem, and a capacity for decision-making that they often lack in situations of dependence. Paid work, she explains, confers a form of discreet but decisive power. The power to say no, the power to choose, the power to free oneself from imposed constraints. Economic independence also allows women to break away from oppressive relationships. In a world where marriage was often less a choice than an economic obligation, being able to provide for one's own needs meant escaping from unwanted or violent unions. Gilman sheds light on this disturbing truth. Millions of women remain trapped in destructive situations simply because they do not have the financial means to extract themselves. For her, this observation constitutes one of the greatest social injustices and a major obstacle to collective emancipation. But Gilman does not stop at talking about the individual advantages of economic independence. She broadens her reflection by demonstrating that this feminine autonomy also benefits society as a whole. When a woman works and earns her living, she actively participates in the production of wealth, stimulates innovation, and enriches the social fabric with her skills and talents. She emphasizes that societies that integrate women into the economy develop more quickly and in a more balanced way because they fully exploit the potential of half of their population. The exclusion of women from the productive world, on the other hand, is not only an individual injustice, it is a colossal loss for the community. Gilman goes even further by analysing the positive effects of this independence on future generations. An economically autonomous woman raises her children in a healthier environment, where she can offer them a better education, greater stability, and richer life models. Far from being a simple change for herself, this autonomy has an impact on the entire family unit and helps to break the cycles of dependence and submission transmitted from generation to generation. A mother who can freely choose to work, to study, or to create becomes a model of emancipation for her children, whether they are girls or boys, transmitting values of equality and autonomy to them. Another fundamental aspect that Gilman develops is the link between work and dignity. She observes that self-respect and social recognition come largely through participation in the productive world. In human societies, she explains, the one who contributes to the common good is valued, recognized, and earns a legitimate place in the group. By depriving women of this possibility of visible and recognized contribution, they are relegated to a marginal position that nourishes feelings of inferiority and frustration. Work, beyond the material aspect, is a vector of social integration that allows women to assert themselves as full-fledged individuals, bearers of rights and duties, and no longer as appendages of their husband or family. Gilman does not ignore the difficulties that women encounter in accessing paid work in often hostile or discriminatory environments. She denounces the systemic barriers, prejudices, and structures that limit their access to skilled and well-paid jobs. But she remains convinced that these obstacles, although powerful, are not insurmountable. She advocates for a profound transformation of mentalities and institutions in order to create conditions where women can work on an equal footing with men without fearing either exploitation or marginalization. This chapter of Women and Economics is distinguished by its profoundly humanistic and progressive vision. Gilman does not present economic independence as a war of the sexes or as a radical break with men. On the contrary, she sees in it a beneficial evolution for all. A society where women are economically autonomous is a more just, more balanced, and more creative society. Men, freed from the exclusive burden of providing for the family's financial needs, can in turn develop other aspects of their lives, whether it be hobbies, education, or community involvement. The independence of women is therefore not a threat to men, but an opportunity to rethink gender relations in a more cooperative and egalitarian way. Gilman also insists on the collective dimension of this emancipation. Economic independence cannot be reduced to an individual accomplishment. It must be thought of as a social dynamic that transforms the structures themselves. As long as institutions, family, school, company, state, do not adapt to integrate this new reality, equality will remain partial and fragile. She therefore calls for profound reforms, ranging from universal access to education and professional training, to the implementation of public policies that promote women's employment and the reconciliation of professional and family life. This chapter highlights a point often neglected in debates on women's emancipation. The economy is the foundation of freedom. Without their own resources, rights remain theoretical and symbolic advances. Gilman formulates it with disarming clarity. True equality is not decreed. It is built through effective access to economic autonomy. She shows that this link between money and power is not only material but profoundly social, because it structures power dynamics, opportunities, and possibilities for choice. She also does not hesitate to project a vision of the future where women's economic independence would open new horizons for all of humanity. She imagines more collaborative, more balanced societies where the talents of each person, men and women, would be mobilized to solve the great collective challenges. This anticipation makes her work a visionary text, ahead of its time, but one that continues to resonate in our contemporary debates on equal pay, the mental load, invisible work, and the valuation of often feminized professions. Through this chapter, Gilman launches a call for awareness and action. She invites women to free themselves from the chains of dependence by entering the world of work, but she also calls on all of society to recognize and support this transformation. Because women's economic independence is not only a question of justice, it is also a condition for building a more prosperous, more creative, and more human world. Chapter 4. Gilman's Vision for a New Society. In this fifth chapter of Women and Economics, Charlotte Perkins Gilman develops a bold and profoundly innovative vision of what a truly egalitarian society could become, a society where the organization of family, work, and daily life would be rethought to fully unleash the potential of women and, by extension, that of all of humanity. Gilman, with a burst of striking modernity for the end of the 19th century, does not merely criticize the established order. She imagines new structures, innovative institutions, and collective ways of life that would allow for an unprecedented balance between the sexes, to overcome the oppressions inherited from the past, and to build human relationships based on cooperation rather than on domination. At the heart of her reflection is an essential idea: the need to profoundly reorganize the family and domestic life. For Gilman, the traditional family model, centered on a strict division of roles between a male provider and a woman assigned to the home, is not only unjust, it is inefficient. It confines women to repetitive and invisible tasks, prevents them from expanding into more creative or productive spheres, and deprives society of the contribution of half of its population. She insists that this archaic organization rests on a fixed vision of the family that no longer corresponds to the changing economic and social realities of her time. The industrial society, in full expansion at the end of the 19th century, demands skills, innovation, and flexibility, yet keeping women out of the circuits of production and exchange amounts, according to her, to slowing down collective development. To break this yoke, Gilman proposes a radical reorganization of domestic life. She imagines a system in which household tasks, rather than being executed in an isolated and repeated manner in each home, would be mutualized and rationalized. The idea of collective kitchens, communal laundries, and shared services runs through her work with a visionary clarity. She anticipates ahead of her time what we today call the collaborative economy or collective municipal services. For Gilman, these communal infrastructures would not only reduce the time and energy devoted to household tasks, but also professionalize these activities, entrusting them to people trained and paid for this purpose. This transformation would free women from the burden of unrecognized domestic work, while also improving the efficiency and quality of the services rendered. One of Gilman's most audacious proposals concerns the care and education of children. She advocates for the creation of collective daycare centers, educational centers, and specialized structures that would offer children a stimulating and secure environment, while allowing mothers to actively participate in economic and social life. At a time when the very idea of entrusting one's children to a public or private institution might seem shocking or irresponsible, Gilman defends this model with powerful arguments. Children would benefit from better quality care, provided by education and early childhood professionals, and mothers would have the freedom to train, work, or engage in intellectual and social activities. She sees in this collectivization of certain aspects of family life not a dehumanization, but on the contrary, a more complete humanization, where individuals freed from material constraints can dedicate themselves to more enriching tasks. This vision of a society organized around shared services and collective infrastructures demonstrates a profound understanding of social mechanisms. Gilman perceives that the isolation of households, each one reproducing the same tasks, is not just a waste of time, but a brake on social evolution. She therefore proposes to rethink the home no longer as an isolated economic unit, but as an integral part of a larger network, in which resources, skills, and responsibilities are pooled. This concept announces ideas that would be found much later in cooperative, community, or even certain public policies aimed at lightening the domestic burden on families. Beyond the material reorganization of daily life, Gilman advocates for a deeper transformation of mentalities and human relationships. She insists that the emancipation of women does not only benefit women themselves, but all of society. A free, educated, economically autonomous woman, liberated from the oppressive constraints of the home, is not only a fulfilled individual. She is a force for change, an engine for innovation, and a pillar of stability for the community. In this new society that she imagines, the relationships between men and women would cease to be marked by power dynamics and would become balanced partnerships, founded on mutual respect, cooperation, and equality of rights and duties. Gilman also shows that this transformation would have positive repercussions on men themselves. Freed from the crushing role of sole providers, men could explore other dimensions of their lives, participate more in the education of children, invest in creative or community activities, and build more authentic relationships with their partners. In this model, marriage would no longer be an economic institution based on dependence, but a free choice based on affection, respect, and the desire to build a common project together. What is striking about Gilman's thinking is her ability to anticipate debates that remain a burning issue today. When she talks about the mutualization of household tasks, she is already laying the foundations for contemporary reflections on the mental load, on the need to better distribute domestic work, and on the recognition of the economic value of this invisible work. When she proposes the creation of collective daycare centres, she paves the way for public policies that, decades later, would be implemented to promote women's access to the labour market. And when she evokes the importance of freeing men from the pressure of economic masculinity, she anticipates modern discussions on the redefinition of masculinities and on the balance of roles within couples and families. This vision is not limited to practical reforms or institutional proposals. It carries a profoundly egalitarian humanist philosophy. Gilman firmly believes that the liberation of women cannot happen without a simultaneous transformation of social structures and mentalities. She insists on the need for an egalitarian education from a very young age so that girls and boys can freely develop their talents without being confined by gender stereotypes. For her, a just society is a society where everyone, regardless of their birth, sex, or social class, can contribute according to their abilities and be recognized for that contribution. This chapter also deploys a reflection on the inseparable link between individual emancipation and collective progress. Gilman explains that the liberation of women, far from creating divisions or conflicts, promotes social cohesion. A society where women can work, create, invent, and participate in collective decisions is a more dynamic, more innovative, and more prosperous society. By giving women the means to express themselves and to act, the intellectual and creative capital of the entire community is enriched. This idea, which may seem obvious today, was revolutionary in her time, when women were still largely excluded from political, economic, and cultural decision-making spheres. Finally, Gilman projects a future where real equality between the sexes would no longer be a distant ideal, but a reality lived daily. In this society, life choices would no longer be dictated by economic constraints or rigid social norms, but by the deep aspirations of each individual. Women could freely choose to be mothers, workers, artists, scientists, or entrepreneurs, without having to sacrifice one or the other of these dimensions. Men, for their part, could explore professional or personal paths without being confined to the role of primary provider. This vision of a more free, more just, and more balanced world remains one of women and economics' major contributions to the debate on equality and on the role of social structures in the construction of individual identities and trajectories. Ultimately, this fifth chapter of Women and Economics is a call to deeply rethink society, not by being content with superficial reforms, but by daring to imagine new organizations where cooperation would replace competition, where the sharing of domestic and economic responsibilities would be the norm, and where each individual, man or woman, could flourish in an environment conducive to collective flourishing. Through her audacity and clairvoyance, Gilman offers a still relevant roadmap for contemporary feminist struggles and for all those who aspire to a more egalitarian and more human world. Chapter 5. The book's legacy and impact. Since its publication in 1898, Women and Economics by Charlotte Perkins Gilman has established itself as a foundational text of modern feminism. In an era when women were still largely excluded from economic, political, and intellectual spheres, the work opened up a new space for reflection on women's place in society and the concrete means to achieve their emancipation. This book was not just a critique of the female condition, but a visionary manifesto proposing audacious reforms and a radical reorganization of family, domestic, and professional structures. Its legacy is immense and unfolds over several generations of feminist movements, influencing debates, inspiring reforms, and maintaining its intact relevance in contemporary discussions on equality, work, and the balance between personal and professional life. From its publication, Women and Economics sparked passionate reactions. First-wave feminists, those who were campaigning for the right to vote, access to education, and decent working conditions, found in this book a rigorous analysis and a clear argument in favor of gender equality. Gilman demonstrated, with supporting figures and observations, that the assignment of women to the domestic sphere was not a natural or biological state, but indeed a social and economic construct intended to maintain their dependence. This demonstration made it possible to deconstruct centuries of patriarchal discourse that justified the subordination of women with supposedly scientific or religious arguments. The book was translated into several languages, circulated in progressive intellectual circles, and cited in numerous debates on social reform, quickly becoming a reference for all those who worked toward the transformation of industrial societies at the turn of the century. Over time, Gilman's influence has amplified, notably in the feminist movements of the 20th century. During the 1960s and 1970s, during the second-wave feminism, her ideas were rediscovered and reinterpreted in light of new struggles for equal pay, the right to abortion, contraception, and the emancipation of women through paid work. The activists of this period found in Women and Economics a source of inspiration and a theoretical framework that allowed them to think about the link between domestic oppression and economic dependence. Thinkers such as Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique, and Simone de Beauvoir with The Second Sex, extended and deepened Gilman's reflections by analysing how social, cultural, and economic structures continued to reproduce inequalities, even in modern and industrialised contexts. Gilman's analyses of domestic servitude and the need to collectivise certain functions related to the family, such as childcare or meal preparation, found a particular resonance in these decades marked by the massive entry of women into the labour market and by demands for a better sharing of domestic responsibilities between men and women. The legacy of Women and Economics is not limited to activist spheres. It has also influenced the social and economic sciences. By proposing an economic reading of the female condition, Gilman anticipated works that much later would give rise to disciplines such as feminist economics or gender studies applied to the analysis of public policies. Her insistence on the recognition of domestic work as a job in its own right, although unpaid, fueled research that made it possible to quantify the economic value of these invisible activities and to pave the way for demands for their consideration in economic and fiscal systems. Even today, work on the mental load, the unequal distribution of household tasks, and the valuation of reproductive work are part of an intellectual continuity that goes back directly to Gilman's pioneering analyses. The book also retains a very strong resonance in current debates on equality, work, and the balance between family and professional life. In a world where women are present in almost all sectors of the economy but continue to face wage gaps, glass ceilings, and a double workday between professional and domestic life, Gilman's arguments remain strikingly relevant. She had already identified, well ahead of her time, that women's economic emancipation could not be limited to access to paid employment, but that it required a structural transformation of society, including the redistribution of domestic responsibilities and the creation of collective infrastructures. Contemporary discussions on parental leave, flexible hours, remote work, and public childcare policies echo the solutions she had outlined more than a century ago. Furthermore, Gilman's critique of the naturalization of gender roles remains essential for understanding the resistance that persists in the face of true equality. She had demonstrated that differences in behaviours or life choices between men and women were not the result of immutable biological determinisms, but of deeply rooted social constructs. This analysis still sheds light today on debates about gender stereotypes, on the education of children, and on the need to rethink educational models to allow everyone to develop outside the yokes imposed by tradition. Her call for an egalitarian education particularly resonates in discussions on co-education, encouraging girls in scientific and technological disciplines, and deconstructing the prejudices that still hinder their progress in certain sectors. The impact of women and economics is also measured by its ability to cross eras without losing its force. While the social and economic context has changed profoundly since the end of the 19th century, the structures of inequality that she denounced persist in new forms. Globalization, the precariousness of work, the rise of the digital economy, and the complexification of career paths have certainly opened up new opportunities for women, but they have also created new challenges that are strangely reminiscent of those Gilman had identified. The inequality in the distribution of domestic tasks, the difficulty of balancing work and family, wage discrimination, and gender stereotypes remain realities in most contemporary societies. This is why this book remains an essential reference for all those who seek to understand the mechanisms of gender domination and to develop solutions to overcome them. In addition, Gilman's resolutely constructive and optimistic approach continues to appeal. Unlike some critical discourses that are content to denounce without proposing alternatives, she always sought to imagine concrete and applicable solutions, whether through the collective organization of domestic tasks, the creation of daycare centers and public infrastructures, or the reinvention of relationships between men and women on an egalitarian basis. This pragmatic dimension of her thinking makes it a valuable resource for political decision-makers, urban planners, educators, and all those who are working to rethink our ways of life according to the real needs of individuals and families. The legacy of women in economics is also cultural and intellectual. The book has inspired generations of writers, sociologists, activists, and thinkers who, each in their own way, have extended and updated her ideas. Figures such as Virginia Woolf, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, or Angela Davis, although from different backgrounds, have all, in their own way, engaged in a dialogue with the themes set forth by Gilman. Emancipation through economic independence, the critique of patriarchal structures, and the importance of rethinking human relationships on a basis of cooperation and mutual respect. This ability of the text to nourish multiple reflections and to adapt to very different contexts explains its longevity and its power. Today, in a world faced with complex challenges such as the climate crisis, growing economic inequalities, and technological changes, Gilman's ideas take on a new dimension. The mutualization of resources, community cooperation, and the need to rethink the organization of work and family are themes that resonate with a particular acuity. Her advocacy for collective infrastructures and for an equitable redistribution of domestic responsibilities finds an echo in discussions on smart cities, collaborative housing, public services, and the need for more inclusive and more equitable social policies. Ultimately, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's book is not just a historical testimony or a museum piece of feminist thought. It is a living tool, a source of inspiration that is still relevant for those who aspire to a more just and more egalitarian society. Its strength lies in its ability to articulate a profound critique of inequalities with a clear vision of possible solutions, and to remind us that the emancipation of women cannot be dissociated from a collective project of social transformation. More than a century after its publication, Women in Economics continues to pose fundamental questions. What place is given to women's invisible work? How can domestic and parental tasks be equitably redistributed? How can human relationships be built, freed from power dynamics? All these questions, far from having lost their relevance, still impose themselves forcefully in contemporary debates. Closing the pages of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Women and Economics, a powerful truth emerges. Economic independence is the bedrock upon which all forms of freedom for women are built. With visionary clarity, Gilman never stopped reminding us that without financial autonomy, there can be no true emancipation. Being free isn't just about being able to dream or express yourself, it's about having the concrete means to choose your life, to say yes or no, to assert yourself in the world without fearing dependency or the constraints imposed by economic and social structures that assign women to predefined roles. This simple and powerful idea remains strikingly relevant in a world where inequalities persist, sometimes in more subtle but equally real forms. Gilman offers us a timeless message. The fight for equality is not over. It is a constant process of transformation and vigilance. While immense progress has been made, the right to vote, access to education, the opening of the job market, and laws protecting women's rights, there are still obstacles to overcome. Wage gaps, the underrepresentation of women in decision-making positions, the disproportionate mental load in the domestic sphere, and economic and psychological violence are all reminders that the road is still long. This book pushes us to never be satisfied with what has been gained, to remain aware and active in this struggle for true equity, where gender would never again determine an individual's worth or possibilities. This conclusion is also an invitation to reflect. Reading Women and Economics is to confront a text that, despite being over a century old, directly challenges us, questioning our choices, our ways of life, and our priorities. It's about asking ourselves how we can, on our own scale, continue this fight. By raising our daughters and sons with equality, supporting inclusive policies, encouraging women's financial autonomy and creativity, and above all, by breaking the invisible chains of economic and social dependence. To you who are reading these lines, I encourage you not only to dive into Gilman's complete work, but also to share this knowledge with those around you. Every page of this book is a source of inspiration, an invitation to rethink the world through the lens of equality and justice. And if you feel the power of this message, I also invite you to join our community on the Wise Woman channel, a space where we continue together to analyze, reflect, and move forward on the path of feminine emancipation. Because deep down what Gilman teaches us is that every woman who asserts herself, who chooses, who creates, who rises up, opens a door for others. Economic independence is not just an individual conquest, it is a collective lever that transforms families, societies, and the world. This book is much more than a historical manifesto. It is a light that still illuminates our time and pushes us to act, to dream, and to build a future where women's freedom will no longer be an ideal, but a reality lived by all.